lockdowns in Canada have gone on a lot longer than the United States. When this COVID was in full swing, say about a year ago,
right.
I did some runs down to Detroit and Chicago, Kentucky, and so on, and I had that deer in the headlight look because I saw so very few people wearing masks, and I saw people just going about their daily business, right? At truck stops or wherever. Whereas up in Canada, full mask, you couldn't get into a store without a mask, you couldn't get into a restaurant without a mask, and sports were canceled and so on. So I think the lockdowns in Canada hit harder than the United States, and they were enforced more.
If you've been seeing news from north of the border and wondering just what's happening there with so-called Freedom Convoy protests soon entering their third week in Canada and centered in part in the Canadian national capital of Ottawa, but also impeding traffic and or totally shutting down border crossings with blockades and the like, maybe the words you heard at the top explain a little bit of it. That was the voice of Alberta, Canada-headquartered owner-operator Mike Murchison. Not a direct participant in those protests, but a clear-eyed watcher of what's going on in Canadian trucking and society, generally speaking. I'm Todd Dills, and in this edition of Overdrive Radio, we'll hear much more from Murchison about the protest's origins among truck operators facing down a new COVID-19 vaccination requirement imposed by both the U.S. and Canada on essential travelers across the border, including freight haulers for the first time. Those requirements came into play, as many of you will know, in the latter weeks of January. The difference in approach in the U.S. when it comes to their own citizens coming back into the country. Canada's vaccination requirements at the border for Canadian citizens required quarantine for any unvaccinated Canadian coming back in. The U.S. did not. Functionally, the Canadian quarantine requirement of returning citizens, at least as it pertains to cross-border commercial haulers, might be something of a ridiculous, at the very least redundant, rule. Given each country's vaccination requirements for entry, ensure that any cross-border commercial trucker coming back into his or her country will be vaccinated, but the optics of the Canadian requirement of the country's own citizenry, perhaps, seem to have lent fuel to the fire of the protest effort countrywide there. Likewise, the basic bedrock importance of the U.S. market for a Canadian trucker, which I asked Murchison directly about. Basically, I wondered if the owner-operator might explain the importance from the advantage of his long cross-border experience from both U.S. and Canadian sides.
It's huge. You have 10 times the population. You have 10 times the consumer there than here, right? Canada trucking domestically, you'll only do so well, and the loads, I would have to say, don't pay as well running domestically in Canada. Because we do have a lot of trucks up here, and we have a lot of undercutting going on and, backroom competition and so on. Whereas if a Canadian driver were to go to the U.S., he has a bigger market that he can draw from, if he's using the load broker services, Get Loaded, C.H. Robinson, Traffic Tech, whoever it is. He has a bigger market to draw from, and there's always stuff coming out of the United States going into Canada. Always. Yep. Depending on what sector you're in, if you're in the deck end, over-dimensional, reefer work, van work, there's more loads coming into Canada than loads going out of Canada in the United States. But for an owner-operator, if he makes that decision not to get vaccinated and not to cross the border, then I think he's going to have a hard time when it comes to the bottom line. You can't, a lot of guys over the years have run to the oil patch. The oil patch goes up, everybody's making money, and then it crashes down. That's a cycle. That goes on all the time. It's different this time around because the oil patch isn't out there throwing money around left, right, and center. So a lot of guys look at the oil patch as a saving grace. I can always go put my truck on at the patch. Well, it's not there this time. It's recovering. The price of oil per barrel, West Texas, is going up.
Oh, yeah.
Right? But the freedom of the flow of money is not happening right now. So for a Canadian owner-operator who's crossing the border, I would say do it. If you don't want to get the vaccine, well, hold out as long as you can. If you choose to get the vaccine, that's your right, and just carry on as business as usual, right? Because at the end of the day, Todd, an owner-operator is running a business, right? And he has to, at some point through all this, look look at his books every month and look at his accounts payable and accounts receivable and say, I spent 3 weeks in Ottawa and I haven't made $1, and I got a truck payment, and I got a shop bill to pay, and I got a mortgage to pay. At some point, this is all going to hit home. And this is why I said earlier in the conversation, this is going to change, because at some point, if you want to remain an owner-operator, you're going to have to make that tough decision to leave the protest, go back to work, and find some other way to support it, or stay there and possibly go broke, because contractors aren't paying owner-operators to sit in these protests.
I'd say that's something of a sure thing, at least. After a quick break for a word from Overdrive Radio sponsor, First Guard, we'll dive into Murchison's history and much more. Keep tuned.
First Guard provides commercial truck insurance to leased owner-operators done right, as we've done for more than 80 years. We provide physical damage and non-trucking. Many companies make you pay up to 6 months of insurance premiums up front, but not First Guard. We bill monthly, so you get quality insurance without needing to pay a lot of cash up front. Go to firstguard.com. That's 1stguard.com. First Guard. We speak trucker. Let's talk.
I'm from Sydney, Nova Scotia, Cape Breton. I've been living in Coaldale, Alberta, which is about 2.5 hours south of Calgary. I'm living here for over 35 years now. I'm married to my wife, Donna. We have 2 boys, Clayton and Cody. They're both grown. Cody's 29, Clayton's 34. I've been trucking for 32 years now. I spent the last 21 as an owner-operator. Did a lot of reefer work, was the majority of it, across Canada and the United States. Most of it was a lot of LTL food and, frozen and fresh food. Done some deck work, done some van work. I'm currently working with a company out of Lethbridge. We haul granulated fertilizer. We haul that out of southern Alberta area down into Idaho, down to Idaho Falls area. We haul it over to Washington State, various places there, Othello, Grandview, and around there. And we haul fertilizer back out of Idaho back up to Alberta. So that's what I'm doing right now, and it's a good job. I did reefer for a lot of years and missed a lot of sleep, and 2 o'clock in the morning grocery warehouse deliveries. And this is nicer because I actually get my 10 hours sleep or my 8 hours sleep every night. And the ag sector here, they work a little kinder hours, so I'm working in the day and I'm resting at night, which I really enjoy.
And how often does that get you back home? Is it on just a weekly basis, or are you getting back multiple times during the week?
No, I'm usually get home maybe a late Friday night or an early Saturday morning, and I'm home till Monday or Sunday night. It's my choice if I want to leave on a Sunday night to get a head start, Right. So I'm usually home for the weekends, which is good because I've got one backlogged honeydew list that I've been starting to whittle away on. I usually end up doing a rounder and a half, I suppose,
Okay.
Because from southern Alberta area down to, say, Idaho, if you're going down to, it could be the Twin Falls area, the Boise area, or, Pocatello area that way. You're either looking at a good 11 to 13-hour drive, depending on where you're going. You'll spend a day driving, you'll unload the next morning, and then you'll reload about three hours away, and then make your way back home. So I usually end up with 3 loads a week on the truck.
Gotcha.
That's how it ends up.
And everything you're doing is cross border, or is it some
everything.
of it? Everything, yeah.
No, everything's cross border.
Mm.
I don't do within the province or within the provinces anymore. This is a company that I'm working with. It's strictly cross border. So I get to cross at Sweetgrass Coots there, just south of Lethbridge, where they're holding that big protest down there now. And I cross at Kingsgate, Eastport, Idaho, Kingsgate, British Columbia. I cross there. So yeah, we're up in the northwestern United States here, and I'm crossing 3-4 times a week sometimes.
One of those regular crossing points owner-operator Murchison mentioned, at Coots, Alberta, and Sweetgrass, Montana, had briefly opened back up for potential crossing the day before we talked, Tuesday earlier this week, about a week and a half into the protests that had been staged there and ultimately blockaded the entire border on the Canadian side. I asked Murchison whether he'd crossed at all through Coutts during the protests going on.
No, I haven't, but I'll be going through Coutts late tomorrow night. I'll be going through Coutts. Now, the highway was actually blocked off during the first week there, north and southbound, and they negotiated to open up a lane. So they're allowing trucks and travelers through one lane. U.S. and Canada Customs were closed down there for one night because they had the highway blocked, so no traffic was going anywhere. So it's open now. I mean, you could choose to go that way, and they're very peaceful. It's a very peaceful protest. Nobody's going to be throwing rocks and getting violent with you because you're going, because they understand that some trucks have to keep rolling, right? Because if everybody shut down, if the entire country had shut down, then your store shelves would be empty, right? So there's guys out there working, and the protesters and members of the Freedom Convoy, they're okay with that. They don't have a problem with that.
When we talked, Murchison had just crossed, headed southbound to Washington State, though. And by the time he was in position to plan his route back, protesters at Coutts had shut everything down again. He had to cross at Del Bonita, Montana, he told me later, well west of Coutts.
I do articles for a magazine out of Toronto called Road Warrior News.com, and I've been writing articles about it, from how I see it out here on the road and people I've talked to. And I've talked to a lot of people on both sides of the border about what's going on. I'll give you the side that I've seen from the U.S. perspective. A lot of people, and I've talked to not just truck drivers, I've talked to farmers, I've talked to truck stop staff, I've talked to just anybody I meet along the way. If I feel like asking the question, I'll ask it. I'll ask them what they think of the protest, and everyone that I've asked about it has just given me the opinion that they're really glad it happened. They're proud of people for doing it, and they say it's about time. And a few of them have said they wish it would happen down here in the United States as well. On the Canadian side, people are very happy. It's about time. It feels like a great big weight has been lifted off the shoulders of, Canadian citizens. And they feel like this is very important, and they're accomplishing something. And now that this, train got rolling, it's not going to stop, right? At some point, yes, the convoys and the protesters may have to disassemble. This isn't the end of it. They'll find other ways. Every member of government on all levels in the country are aware of what's going on. They heard what's going on, and everybody's just kind of scratching their head, wondering, okay, what next? If we lift the mandate, what's next?
When Murchison talks about mandates, it's not just the cross-border vaccine requirement newly imposed on commercial haulers on both sides of the border. He and various other protest factions mean more than that, ultimately. Various provincial mask mandates, school closure efforts, other limitations on business and life and travel in general, imposed in ways, as you'll hear a little bit more about later, that are a good deal more sweeping than what we've seen on this side of the border, at least where I live and have traveled the last year for sure.
Maybe nothing will happen, everything will go back to normal and be fine. Maybe, the COVID virus might increase. It's hard to say. There's various health regions, that run the hospitals in different provinces that are pressuring the premiers not to lift the mandates because they're overworked already with backlogs of elective surgeries and COVID cases and so on. Right. And they feel if the provinces lift the vaccine mandates, they could be swamped with more cases. And our hospital, our healthcare system right now is just right at the limits. Nurses and doctors have been working their butts off for the last 2 years.
Yep.
And there's those who feel that it's time. For 2 years we've had these mandates and restrictions and lockdowns put on us. They're fed up with it. They're sick and tired of it, and they just somehow want to get on with some sense of normalcy in their life. And the biggest sufferers of this that I've asked around, what I've seen, are kids. Kids. You can blink your eye one day and school's open, the next day it's closed. And kids are social creatures. They need to interact with other kids. They need to do sports. And they've lost a lot of that over the last 2 years, and they're the ones whose well-beings are suffering the most.
The thing that sparked this the Freedom Convoy protest, ostensibly anyway, was the cross-border mandates that came into place on both sides of the border, effectively in January. But I mean, I get the sense, like reading about Canada's response to the pandemic and knowing what I know about how things have played out in most places here in the United States, that there's a little bit of there's a difference there. Do you have the same feeling in that regard? Are there other, vaccine in particular mandates in Canada that don't exist in the U.S., or are we talking about a lot of the lockdowns, the forced closure of certain businesses? Did it go on longer in Canada than it did in the U.S.? Has it been more extensive?
The lockdowns in Canada have gone on a lot longer than the United States. When this COVID was in full swing, say about a year ago,
right.
I did some runs down to Detroit and Chicago, Kentucky, and so on, and I had that deer in the headlight look, because I saw so very few people wearing masks, and I saw people just going about their daily business, right, at truck stops or wherever. Whereas up in Canada, full mask. You couldn't get into a store without a mask. You couldn't get into a restaurant without a mask, and sports were canceled and so on. So I think the lockdowns in Canada hit harder than the United States, and they were enforced more than in the United States. Now, with the cross-border vaccine, I have never been formally asked to show proof of vaccine to any U.S. border agent. I've never. I would say, do you want to see my proof of vaccine? And they normally say no. They just want your paperwork for your load coming in.
Right.
Whereas
that's only been in place, Mike, since the 22nd of last month. So you've crossed since then, obviously.
Oh yeah. I've crossed at Sweetgrass Coots. I've crossed at Carway, which is west of that. I've crossed at Del Bonita, which is west of that, and I've crossed at the Eastport Kingsgate. And I have never had an officer ask me, I want to see proof of vaccine, or you're not coming in. Whereas on the Canada side, a different story. You cross at a Canada border, take Sweetgrass, for example, or Eastport, Idaho. They want you to roll up to the booth. They want you to have a mask on. They want to see proof of vaccination. And this is something that's interesting for Canadian truckers who go across the border back into Canada. The government put out this thing called Arrive Canada app. Right. And you had to register for this.
Yeah. I'm familiar with it. A lot of U.S. truckers have to do it too. Yeah.
Okay. And it's tied into your passport. So when you roll up to the booth, you give them the paperwork for your load, you give them your passport, and when they scan your passport, it shows on your passport that you've been vaccinated, or if you haven't been vaccinated, right?
And because you can put that in that Arrive Canada app.
Yeah. And if you arrive at the border and you haven't been vaccinated, speaking with a customs officer at Coots just before the protest happened, I asked him, I said, so if I roll through here and I'm not vaccinated, take me through the steps. What's going on? He says, you're allowed to deliver your load. You have to go home. And then I said, in quarantine. I said, well, what if your home is 900, 1,000 miles away? I said, are you allowed to get a load to take home? He says, yes, but you can't deliver it. Which makes total sense, right?
Right, sure.
The situation, Todd, is really fluid up here, right? I mean, yes, you have the protest staged at Coots. You have the big one in Ottawa. You have smaller ones that go for a few days, say at Sumas, Washington, or down there. Sumas, Washington is just south of Vancouver. That's the commercial port for trucks out of the Vancouver area to cross. So they've had a protest down there. And so the situation's fluid in the sense that things are changing, but the protesters are still staying there. They're still getting donations coming in. They're still getting support and food. And what happened at Coots this last weekend here, Coots and Sweetgrass, Coots on the Canada side, the RCMP there, they're there in force. They have like 40 vehicles there and about 6 tactical units down there. And they're stopping people from, this weekend they were stopping people from delivering diesel fuel and gas to the trucks and the protesters down there. And they were stopping people from delivering firewood because they're having, bonfires in the middle of the median there to stay warm, right? That developed this weekend. And yesterday in Ottawa, police confiscated a lot of gas and diesel, out of jerry cans and so on from truckers and supporters. And then today they gave it all back.
There's a lot of we're just gonna wait this out, and then maybe we should try a little bit harder line. Well, maybe we don't want to do that. That's a lot of mixed messaging going on.
You have to look at for every step, whether it be the law enforcement in the municipalities or the government for that matter. This is a well-organized protest, Pod. This wasn't just thrown together. This is well-organized. They have a command center in Ottawa where the convoy organizers are working out of. They have one in Coots there, down by Sweetgrass. This is well-funded. It's funded, from people donating, not just across North America, but from all over the world. It's organized, and they are stressing that it be peaceful. And it is being peaceful. There was 1 or 2 incidents in Ottawa, you might have heard of.
Oh, yeah.
But when you figure there's thousands of people down there, 1 or 2 instances, says a lot about the conduct of the organizers and the protesters and the supporters.
Since we talked, that seems to have more or less remained the case, though I know plenty will argue it's truly an open question whether entire blockades of major arteries across the border can really be described as peaceful. Murchison and I didn't talk about it that day, but as we spoke, the very biggest crossing at Detroit and Windsor, Ontario, across the Ambassador Bridge, accounting for roughly 40% of all U.S.-Canada trade volume by some estimates, have been mostly shut down itself, and as of yesterday, February 10th, remains so. I spoke to Murchison this morning, February 11th again, and he noted the Ontario government had declared a state of emergency and were threatening fines, license suspensions, and more for those impeding that bridge's traffic. And out in Alberta, similar ramp-ups in enforcement activity were underway. With respect to the Ontario border, the blocking of the bridge is essentially made illegal, said Ontario Premier Doug Ford. A BBC report on the emergency order noted protesters might face as much as a year in jail and $100,000 in fines. Quote, "There will be consequences, and they will be severe," Ford said. My talk with Murchison earlier in the week turned here to the view from afar of Canadian leadership in Ottawa and the unwillingness to engage with protesters at all, even as some provincial governments across Canada seem to be having a better time of it, in a sense, though clearly not all of them. There seems to be a real lack of empathy here, like on the part of the folks in charge up there, and just the unwillingness to actually engage at all. In some cases, and to belittle in others, but yeah.
I'll address that simply by saying you're correct.
Okay.
The Prime Minister and his party that's in power, the Liberal Party, have been very, distant about this.
Yeah.
They don't want to interact with any organizers of the convoy. That's what the convoy organizers are asking for. Sit down at the table and let's talk. But the Prime Minister doesn't want to do that. He's keeping his distance, and the Minister of Transport is just criticizing this thing as a bunch of hooligans and people who are messing up the economy and disrupting people's lives, right? And so there is the lack of wanting to communicate. And so that addresses the question, okay, if the leaders of your country don't want to talk to representatives of these thousands of people across the country. What does that say about the leader of the country? To me, it says he's not much of a leader. And this is not going to go away anytime soon. I mean, these protests may change form a bit, but it's not going to go away anytime soon, because I honestly believe, and a lot of people do, that a sleeping giant has been woken up here.
The Canadian trucking associations, though, have expressed no support, I think, of the tactics that are being deployed here. They are, I think, vocally in agreement on the notion of the cross-border vaccine mandate, and that it should be not required. But down here on the U.S. side, the Owner-Operator Independent Drivers Association yesterday actually formally sent letters to both governments on both sides to request that vaccine mandate be removed. But the other major trucking associations have been pretty mum on that, though, have actually actively fought vaccine mandates otherwise that have been attempted by the Biden administration down here. Do you am I right about that in terms of the Canadian trucking associations at least agreeing on that part of what's happening here?
Yeah, you're definitely right. They don't support the way this protest is going on. Some things they agree with, and that was made well known right at the start of this, that the Canadian Trucking Association does support this. But when you look at the Canadian Trucking Association, I mean, they're interested in business and keeping business fluid and going. And I see their point, because at the end of the day, Todd, this is going to end, right? At some point, these big convoys and protests and so on, they're going to end, and people are going to have to get back to business at hand, earning a living, making the truck payments, paying their family, and all that stuff, right?
Yep.
And you have customers to go to. And at some point, you're going to have to face your customers. So I see where the CTA is coming from here.
That's CTA, the Canadian Trucking Alliance, somewhat akin to the American Trucking Associations on this side of the border. When I was speaking about quote-unquote Canadian trucking associations, I was also thinking about the smaller private motor truck council as well, which had been vocal in opposition to the cross-border vaccine requirements.
They may not approve of the fact that, these protests are going on across the country, and they're down at Coots, and they're in Ottawa, and they're in Sumas, and they're in Regina, and Calgary, right? Because their main interest is business, right? The box stores, the Costco's, the Walmarts, and all those. I get that. I understand. And they're entitled to their opinion. But, the convoy, the protest organizations, they've let it be known that they're very much aware that the Canadian Trucking Association doesn't support this, and that's okay. That's okay.
Yeah. But they are in agreement that the cross-border vaccine mandate should not be in place, I think.
Okay, yeah, they are. They are, definitely.
Yeah. But the protest ultimately is about, it ends up being about more than that, right? It's kind of sparked by this thing that's very somewhat specific, not entirely specific, but very, very vital to a community of truckers that are basically going to lose their lanes if they don't have the vaccine. But it's become something much larger. In terms of your sense of it all, how much of this at this point is still about the trucking piece of that, and how much is about much more than that?
I think it started as protests from truckers regarding the vaccine mandates. It's morphed into something much bigger, which deals with threats to the Charter of Rights and Freedoms here in Canada. We have a constitution, we have the Charter of Rights and Freedoms that guarantee citizens of the country certain rights. Right? That is,
it's like the Bill of Rights down here, basically.
It allows people the right to peace, order, and good government, freedom from hatred, freedom from discrimination, and so on and so forth like that. And this is what this has morphed into now, Todd. It's about rights and freedoms of Canadian citizens, and how with these lockdown mandates and so on in the last 2 years, these rights are slowly getting whittled away little by little because the government keeps moving the goalpost. Right? Mm-hmm. Okay, we locked down the schools. Now it's time to stop the recreational activity with kids. Right? And you can't gather in groups of any more than 20, and you can't do this and you can't do that. And the other thing is inflation, because of this, is going through the roof up here.
What groups of people in Canada were required to get the vaccine as a function of their employment, if any, before this cross-border mandate? Were most people were voluntarily taking it, I'm guessing, or were folks required? Because down here in the U.S., not a lot of people have actually been required to take the vaccine. I think sometimes in the healthcare space, definitely in the healthcare space, there's been some mandates coming from employers, and I think there's a federal one there as well. But just generally, the government has not required folks to actually do that. Is that a difference in Canada too?
Let's just say it was a mutual agreement, okay? And I'll explain that.
Okay.
There are companies here, not just in the trucking sector, that when all this came down, they required their employees to be vaccinated. They didn't force them to. They required them to be vaccinated, or in a lot of cases, they could go look for another job.
Right.
With us, the company that I'm working with and so on, it was understood that when these vaccine mandates came down for the cross-border trucking, right, you were put in a position where you could choose not to get the vaccine and not go down in the United States, but then you would need to look for another job, because the company that I work with, that's all we do is cross-border. Right. And we had a number of fellas that were taking a hard look at that, wondering whether it would be worth it to get the vaccine. So it was an understanding that, well, if you want to keep doing what you're doing because the mandates came down, it might be in your best interest to get the vaccine. That's how it played out. And it's like I say, it's not forced on them, but you're backed into a corner. If you want to continue doing what you're doing for a living, then you have to make that decision. But coercion, yeah, maybe, I'd say. I held off, to be quite honest with you, until October.
Okay.
Of this past year. Okay. Simply because there was too much information out there, pros and cons. Mm-hmm. There hasn't been a long enough test period, of the vaccines and the side effects and so on and so forth. And I held off until October, till it got to a point where I just wasn't able to do a lot of things because I didn't have the vaccine. And it's like, why am I pushed in this corner? I disagree with being forced to take the vaccine, but I had the choice whether to do it or not. And I decided I'll get it. And I've had no effects from it. My wife had no effects from it. I have 2 sons who are dead set against it.
Really? Okay.
Absolutely dead set against it. Right? And I respect their decisions and their reasons why. Okay. So, but they don't travel out of country, and they don't travel across provincial borders. Right.
Are they in trucking?
So my one boy he hauls hopper bottoms, hauls grain around the Saskatchewan area, local. And he goes around, he's home every night. And my oldest son, Clayton, he's a red seal carpenter. He specializes in concrete. That's what he does. Okay. And then to a certain degree, I saw the writing on the wall as far as I'm concerned with what I do for a living. And I thought, I enjoy what I do for a living.
I asked the U.S. Department of Homeland Security about the timing of their decision-making around requiring vaccination of essential truckers crossing the border. Likewise, about any coordination with the Canadian government in terms of requiring the same. Did not receive response in time for this podcast. The earliest mention I can find of plans for vaccination requirements for non-U.S. citizens entering the country, without a caveat exempting essential workers, indeed emerged around the time that Murchison talked about there, when he began to see the writing on the wall and made the moves toward the vaccine. As for me, by then I myself was getting a booster's worth of the Pfizer product. My young daughter had a minor COVID bout a few weeks ago that put her in remote school for a few days. I never picked up the virus myself.
Canada watches the U.S. very closely, right? As to what they're doing, what their policies are, their domestic policies and foreign policies. Yeah. I don't know if the U.S. is watching Canada as close as Canada watches the U.S. because we have a vested interest in our biggest trading partner, right?
Yeah.
And if you couldn't get these trucks across the border, right, because of vaccine mandate stuff, you'd have a real problem. I know Southern Ontario, big manufacturing area, there's 36 million people across the country. They all require food, right? Building supplies, the whole 9 yards, right? So this is why I think Canada went this route to embrace and keep the trade going between the two countries.
Essentially, Murchison's saying he feels U.S. moves toward requiring vaccination of essential travelers coming into the country provided the spark for Canada's own move in that direction and, one might say, the consequences of these protests. In any event, here's a big thanks to owner-operator Murchison for his time and insight. And as you may well know, given my esteemed colleague Long-Haul Paul Marhofer's profile of Murchison several weeks back, part of Paul's long-running Faces of the Road series of oral histories and interviews, Murchison's quite the songwriter. You can find his music via the streaming platforms, including a new single, One More Chance.
A friend of mine died of cancer in the course of a year. He went from a big man, 6'4", linebacker build. He was a trucker for years, and he got stomach cancer, and in the course of the year, he whittled away to nothing, and he couldn't take visitors because the COVID was going on, and it really hit me. And so I just wrote a song. It's not about a specific topic. It's about how we get up in the morning, hit the ground running, run too fast, work too hard, and we don't quite pay attention to the small things, Like the last verse goes, hug your children, love your family, be the one the good Lord intended you to be. Take the high road, you'll walk tall, and be amazed by the beauty of it all. It's an up-tempo song. Kind of got a Johnny Cash beat to it, but it's a song just about reminding people to just stop and take a look about what's important in life.
The owner-operator also wrote and videoed himself performing a tune inspired by the early parts of the Freedom Convoy that you can find a link to in the post that houses this podcast for February 11th, 2022 at overdriveonline.com/overdrive-radio. Overdrive Radio is a production of Overdrive, the voice of the American trucker. It's edited and produced by me, Todd Dills, with acoustic guitar and other additional support from Overdrive Extra contributing writer and trucker-songwriter Long-Haul Paul Marhofer. The podcast is backed up further by Overdrive news editor Matt Cole, social media coordinator Holly Young, and executive editor Alex Lucky. Till next time, keep it pro out there.